You are very welcome here in Abrisco. By the way, we thank you very much. You welcome this invitation. And we hope that we have a good transmission and the people enjoy. Introduce yourself and welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. My name is Kyle Wingate. I have a background in human factors and ergonomics, as well as process and technical safety. I started my career actually in semiconductors and spent a few years there, and then I've been in oil and gas in some capacity for over 20 years now. I was with Shell for about 10 years, downstream, large petrochem and refinery, and then I was in a corporate capacity with Shell, and then I spent about 10 years in consulting with Lloyd's Register and ScanPower and Ristech, doing everything from upstream to downstream and everything in between. And recently, just last year, I switched, and I'm now working for a major midstream company in North America. But my background is, like I said, I've been doing human factors and ergonomics for all of that time, as well as some other types of safety. I have a degree in industrial engineering from Texas A&M, and I have a master's degree in human factors, also from Texas A&M.
Okay, so I will put here the overheads and okay, dokie.
Okay. So today we're going to talk about competency management as well as safety critical task analysis, and these are both pretty big topics, so I'm going to try to get through as much information as I can. And if there are follow-up questions, I'll be happy to answer those or do the best that I can to get more information to anyone that needs it. All right, good. Next slide.
Bill, here we do like that. You do the presentation, and at the end, after when you finish in 1 hour, we start the question and answers. Okay.
Okay. All right. So today this is kind of the agenda. I'll talk a little bit about human factors, but I'm not going to spend much time on that. I'm assuming most people have a general understanding of human factors and human error. And then we'll spend most of the time I'll spend the first part talking a little bit about safety critical task analysis, that technique, that tool, how to use it. And then I'll switch gears and talk a lot about competency, really, because these two tools are interrelated. And so to do competency assessments, you kind of have to do some task assessment as well. So we'll talk a little bit about competency challenges in the industry. I'll go into what is a competency management system, and then I'll finish with a case study. And the case study that I've chosen for today is on a company man competency assessment. Next slide. So just real quick on a recap of human factors, you can think about human factors as a study that's looking at how the individual and the end user is fitting in with their work environment, right? So you can see this little onion on the right-hand side that starts with the end user, and as the layers of the onion get bigger, you have all these other aspects or factors, human factors, that come into play that affect that end user. And in the earlier stages, the end user, the equipment, the workspace, the hardware and the physical things that are around that end user, most of that is really talking about your biggest impact is going to be in the design phase. So that's when you're looking at anthropometrics, size, shape, strength. What is the capabilities of the individual or that end user, and you're looking to then optimize that with their work environment. Then as you get into the outer layers, you look into more of the cognitive and organizational psychology. So this is where it becomes more of an operational focus. And then when you're talking about procedures and competency management, safety climate and culture, and then overall management systems. So for anything for existing assets, for existing operations, you know, you're well past the design phase. And so you many times will focus more of your attention there. But if you are designing new assets, then the earlier you can spend and focus on that, the better. All right, next slide. Okay, so that's kind of human factors and ergonomics in a nutshell. Now, if you look at human error, this is when we start talking about what are the types of errors that can occur. And without going into a lot of detail, you know, there's a lot of different types of these. If you start with the unsafe acts and you look at maybe what's intended and what's not intended, you have different types of errors that can occur. You have slips, lapses, and mistakes. That's what our focus will be today, typically what is encompassed in what we call human error. And if you think about these, the best example that I can get is if you have, say, let's take just something simple like a push button, and there's maybe there's a push button A and a push button B. A slip would be when you press the wrong button. So you know the order, you know it's supposed to go A, B, and for some reason, you know, you start off with B and you hit the wrong button. That would be a slip. A lapse would be that you forgot something. So you were supposed to press A and then B, and you just forgot that you were supposed to press one of them, right? So you inadvertently did that. The last one is a mistake where you know, you intended to do something, and in this case, you intended to hit B first, but it was wrong. So you were trying to do the right thing, but you inadvertently made a mistake because you weren't trained or you weren't aware of that or whatever the reason may be. So in all three of these instances, you know, something happened that we didn't want to happen, but the end user was trying to do the right thing, and they just had three different types of failures or errors that they made. And human errors is inevitable in everything that we do, but it is something that can be looked into closer, assessed, and analyzed, and measures put in place to make it as small as possible. And it says here the goal is to improve performance while reducing the potential risk of human error. So that's the goal that we're going to be looking at today. All right, next slide. This is just a quick recap. This comes from, you know, there's a lot of these charts out there, and I don't put a lot of merit in the percentages, but I will say that it's hard to come up with events that don't involve people in some capacity, right? You may or may not chalk up the final causation to human error. You may have lots of different ways to classify incidents and events, but at some point in the process, usually someone was involved. It may have been in the planning process, or it may have been maintenance, or it may have been inspection, but at some point, people were involved. And many of those errors do link back to organizational weaknesses. And that's why we have the big focus on management systems today, right? Is because we're trying to better understand systemic failures and what we can do about those.
Go ahead.
All right, next slide. Okay, so this is just a slide recapping some tools in our toolkit for human error and human factors. The first being just applying the engineering of human factors engineering in the design phase. So this looks at everything from accessibility, human-machine interface, the ergonomics, control room design, material handling, valve placement, access. You know, all of these things, like I mentioned before, are very important in the design phase to understand and address at that point in time. So there's a lot of different risk studies that can also be applied in that design phase. I'm not going to go into detail about those today. Another big tool that you may have seen big in other industries, especially nuclear, is the HRA, the Human Reliability Analysis. A lot of acronyms here. I didn't spell them all out because it would have taken a whole slide to do so. But these are just so you're understanding, they're all types of human reliability analysis. Some are quantitative, some are semi-quantitative, but they all kind of are trying to look at putting values and understanding how reliable actions and tasks and humans are in certain industries and certain capacities. Okay, we're not going to talk about that today. I have another presentation on that. So we are going to talk about safety critical task analysis. So we'll talk about more about that, and as well as competency assessments. And then lastly, all of your traditional methodologies, HAZIDs, HAZOPs, quantitative risk analysis, root cause analysis, there are ways to integrate human factors into those. And I encourage people to do that as much as possible, because there are ways to do that. So these are just some tools in the toolkit. We're going to be talking about the ones in red today. All right, next slide. All right, so what is a safety critical task? This definition comes from, before I get too far into it, the Energy Institute in the UK has developed a guideline on human factor safety critical task analysis. It's not a bad document. They just revised it last year. That's why it's the second edition. So I've taken some information from them, because it's good information and a good reference point. So if you want a lot more information around safety critical task analysis, I recommend getting that document. Definition here is a task where human factors could cause or contribute to a major accident or fail to reduce the effect of one, including during operational tasks, prevention and detection, control and mitigation, and emergency response. So the keywords here: contribute to a major accident. So the whole point of having something that's safety and critical is you're trying to prioritize tasks that are of significant magnitude that could cause a process safety event, right, or a loss of containment. That's kind of what we're really focused on with safety critical tasks. Okay, next slide. So the big challenge, or one of the big challenges that we have in this, is trying to identify what are these safety critical tasks, right? So you have a lot of resources and sources of information at your disposal, but how do you narrow this list down and pick what you're going to do? Because these techniques that I'm going to talk about today, and really all of the techniques that were listed in one of the prior slides, they can be resource intensive, and they need to be scaled to the right magnitude for whatever you're trying to accomplish, right? So safety critical task analysis many times is applied on a wide scale basis. It does not have to be, but a lot of that tool based on that Energy Institute guideline is talking about doing this for a facility, right? Not just for a particular job or a particular issue, but it can be applied in any type of way. So where do you get this information? Well, you have procedures. Obviously procedures, hopefully some procedures anyway, are going to break tasks down and give, what are the steps that are necessary to do that task. So you can get some information out of there. However, many procedures may or may not have any reference to what is critical or what is a safety critical task. So that would be, something you'd have to further break down. And of course, we don't have procedures for every single thing we do as well. There may be risk studies that you have done that maybe you can pull information from. Fault trees or bow ties, if you have them. Just keep in mind that those risk studies will have to have at least addressed tasks or the human interaction at some component level, right? It would need to be at least to that level of detail to get started. Job profiles. So we have different jobs and what are the roles and responsibilities of those different positions. And so that's actually what I'm going to be talking about next under competency, is starting with that and then going to a safety critical task analysis. But you can start there as well. Maybe incident investigations. Maybe it's something that, in the case study that we have today about the company man, the reason that particular client chose to do that is because they'd had some really major events that were based on decisions and actions of those, they felt, of those personnel. And so that's why they chose to, hone in and apply some of these techniques to that particular job. But that is another option. As you go through the process and you're doing the data collection, you will need to most likely kind of carry out some type of interview or team-based assessment where you as the assessor, whoever that may be, or you're the person that's doing the task analysis, can have a better understanding of what are the job responsibilities and the tasks that are involved. So you can do that through interviews. You can do that through actually observing the job itself. And of course, through all these other sources of information. So most likely, it's going to be a combination of multiple of these that you decide to utilize in your process. And then lastly, it says start with safety critical, await design intent and mapping. So if you're on the design side and you're trying to do some of this, then you may not have all of these other resources at your disposal. And you may only have, hey, what are we planning to do here, right? I have a room, I have a layout, I have pieces of equipment, but I don't have procedures yet or job responsibilities. So at this point, you'd have to take prior experiences and speculate what are the tasks that are going to be involved and start at that point in time. And then lastly, safety critical jobs, equipment, or processes. So you at your facility may have already identified some of these things and deemed them to be safety critical. If you already have that as a starting point, then you can start to narrow down your list of tasks based on this. Okay, so these are just a lot of different ideas on how to get started with narrowing the list down to what are safety critical tasks. All right. Next slide. So this slide also is taken from the UK Energy Institute guideline that I mentioned before. And I'm not planning to cover this whole slide. It's a lot of information, but the middle part here outlines the process for carrying out a safety critical task analysis. We've talked a little bit about, we just got through talking about step 2. Step 1 has kind of assumed that maybe you've already done this, but you need to identify what are your hazards at your site. Many of you probably have already gone through some type of risk analysis to understand what scenarios and consequences might be of concern. Maybe you've done some risk ranking of those. So that's kind of what you need. The reason you need that is because obviously to determine what's safety critical, it's going to be things that are associated that could lead to one of those events, right? So that's step 1, really outside of this process almost. Then step 2, we just talked about identifying the safety critical tasks. Okay, so steps 3 through 6 talk about understanding the tasks, representing critical tasks, identifying human failures and performance influencing factors. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then looking at safety measures. All of that is what I would call the engine of doing a safety critical task analysis. So that is going through the exercise of breaking tasks down into components or subtasks, walking through maybe like a workshop setting to where you're breaking those down and you're analyzing those tasks. Now that you know what they are, you're analyzing them for, hey, what type of errors, based on that human error chart we showed earlier, could there be a mistake? Or what is the likelihood of having someone make a mistake or have a lapse while they're doing some of these things? And if they did, how many layers of protection do we really have before that negative consequence occurs, right? So it's almost like, just like you've done maybe in other studies where you're looking at layers of protection, where you're going through a HAZOP, you're doing that from a human perspective in this, and you're looking at it from a task-based component. And then you're looking, and in some of these exercises, they'll have guide words, just like a HAZOP would, so you can have guide words that's involved, and we'll look at an example here in just a minute. And then you want to look at the performance shaping influence factors. So sometimes they're called PSFs, performance shaping factors, and sometimes they're called performance influencing factors. All that is a categorization. You know, is it related to mistakes? Is it related to misjudgment? Is it related to decision making? It's just classifying and breaking things down into a component level. And then lastly, you want to look, like I said before, at what safety measures do you have in place now? Do you feel like that's adequate? Should we make some recommendations to do something else? And so that is those steps 3 through 6 wrapped up. And then at the end here, just like any good management system, they have the number 7 is implement. So put into, you know, whatever you decided that came out of your study, you would put in place, and then you would monitor to make sure it's achieving what you wanted to achieve. And then the last step there is looking at the process itself. Given the fact that this may be something new that you're doing, should you modify how you're approaching that safety critical task analysis itself to make it better, to work for your company or your situation better? Because these are just tools, and they have to be used in a fit for purpose and customized way to be effective. Okay, like I said, so a lot more information on this in the guidance document published by the UK if you want to read on more about that, but this is the overall process. All right, next slide. Okay, so this is just a quick snapshot. If you were to walk through that exercise, like I was just talking about, of doing that analysis, you know, if a lot of times it's done in a spreadsheet. I mean, obviously there's probably other software tools you can use, but if you were to just look at a spreadsheet, and these are some of the column headings you might see. So we would start out obviously with, what are we analyzing? What job is it? You know, what are the tasks that we're talking about? And then it would go on to think as to what are the potential consequences of failure. So what could happen if this doesn't go correctly? If this is done inappropriately or not done, what could happen? And then as you walk through here, you'd talk a little bit about, okay, what type of failures could occur? What are the human error failures that we expect to occur during that type of task? We talk about them. We talk about maybe how often that would happen, or maybe assign like a risk rating to that to give us some type of context of the severity or the likelihood as well. We apply those performance shaping factors that I mentioned before. And then we go on to talk about what are the existing controls, and do we feel that that's adequate, or do we need to make a recommendation to make an additional safeguard or control to put in place? And that's really it. Just like any other risk workshop, it walks through that. But obviously, if you're doing this on a task level or even a subtask level, because you have to get down to a step-by-step process, because you have to understand what is the person actually doing. You don't want to do this on thousands and thousands of tasks, right? You want to prioritize this to the critical few and the ones that are going to give you the risk reduction you're looking for. Okay, and as I've said a couple of times already, and I'll probably say a couple of more times in this presentation, make sure you understand that human factor techniques like this are scalable and need to be scaled for the correct application. If you try to do the full gamut and go to the nth level of detail on too much, it's going to become so overwhelming that you really will just stop the process. And I've seen that happen many times. Okay. So that's all I was going to really focus on the safety critical task analysis. Obviously, we could spend a lot more time on it, but that's a high-level overview of what that process looks like. And now I want to kind of switch gears and talk about how to apply that in a little bit more of a grouped way under the heading of competency. So if you go to the next slide, we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about competency. And then obviously these are very related. When you talk about tasks, a lot of those human errors are based on competency of personnel, right? So many times after you get through a safety critical task analysis, you can group a lot of potential human errors and then build them under competency profiles, right? Some of that boils down to training, but some of it is a little bit beyond what you would typically call training. Okay. So anyway, some challenges that we have in doing this, and when we look at competency, human error, as I'm sure we all know, is very closely tied to almost every big event we've had, and I have a few examples on the next couple of slides here. But it's definitely a big it's a big issue that is kind of can be difficult to deal with. Competency of safety critical roles is crucial to safety and performance, but a lot of times that's not very well defined. So we know we have jobs that are maybe more critical in terms of front line and what those people are doing, or maybe decision makers, but yet sometimes we don't have good tools and techniques to understand how well they're ready to take on some of those tasks. So developing processes to monitor, develop, and assure competency can be a time-consuming and difficult challenge, right? And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about. Training and certifications are fairly narrow in their range of technical skills that they look at. Obviously, they have to be done at a certain level to maybe, especially if you talk about external certifications, they'll get you, part of the way on technical competence, but they're not going to be job specific or go into a lot of detail as what's required. But a lot of times the biggest miss is the non-technical skills. We're going to talk a lot about that. And then lastly, sometimes we see people in jobs that maybe they're not ready for, just because they've served, they've had a certain tenure, they've been around for a certain period of time, or there's a vacancy and we have to fill that back. For those of you, in the industry for a long time, you've seen the cyclical market that we have and the ups and the downs. And sometimes we lose a lot of people and then the market bounces back. And what do? Now we don't have qualified people to fill all of these job responsibilities. So we just start doing the best that we can by putting people in these positions. And sometimes that can create problems. Okay, next slide. So real quickly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these events. I'm sure everyone is very familiar, but a couple of offshore big events that we all know of. But I just extracted a couple of statements from the reports. The massive reports that came out of the Deepwater Horizon. Volume 3, there's a section on human factors, specifically competency. It says technical competency is only one aspect of an individual's performance capabilities, and other non-technical skills are necessary to prepare individuals to manage the natural variability inherent within the complex system. And there's a whole chapter on this. It's just one expert, but I mean, they do recognize that this is something that that's difficult to manage, but it is a big impact on the way we do our business. If we go back in time, back to 1988, we see the same things, right? It says, while training on the job no doubt has a part to play in the full training of personnel in positions of responsibility for safety, I consider that it should not be the sole or primary means of training. It suffers from the crucial weaknesses of perpetuating or accumulating errors. So even back then, they recognized that, yeah, we're doing what we call training, and most of that is on-the-job training, meaning that we're showing people what they need to do. But keep in mind, if we don't have a more robust environment around that, the errors of old will also become the errors of new. And if we don't have good procedures and things like that to fall back on, then we end up in a bad place. The next slide is just a quick onshore example. Talks about BP Texas City. So this is real close to my home. When this event happened, I was working at Shell just down the road, and many of our responders had to respond to that event. But if you look into the report, there's several different quotes here that deal with training and competency. The first one says, operator training for abnormal situations was insufficient. Talks about managers do not effectively conduct performance appraisals to determine the level of knowledge and training. There was no development plans for these operators. There was no standard operating instructions for the board operator. Other training material was limited in scope and detail. So, even here in I consider this modern times, there's a lot of missing pieces of the puzzle, and even today, these things are still challenges for us. Okay, next slide. So we've talked a little bit about this already, but just understanding competency a little bit better, we're talking about the ability to perform activities within an occupation or function to the standards expected in employment. But it's complicated, it's complex. We have to deal with jobs that are evolving. We got new technology or new equipment, new procedures. These things are always evolving and changing. So it's hard to keep up with. And then you got organizational change with maybe manning levels or reassignment of roles and responsibilities that have an impact, as well as the individual and their perception, their behavior, what are their skills and capabilities. All this comes into play. And then, as we mentioned a little bit already, but there's different competencies that we need to consider. Many times we focus heavily on technical skills, and we should, because those are important. But we have to realize that it's just one type of competency that we need to consider. We also have to think about cognitive skills such as problem solving and situational awareness, as well as interpersonal skills like leadership and communication and teamwork. Behaviors and people's attitudes come into play here. And so that's something we have to take into account. Okay, next slide. All right, so talk a little bit about what is a competency management system, a CMS. This is based on an ISO standard 17969, if anybody would like to go back and look up more information around this. But like any management system, it is based on a plan, do, check, review, improve cycle. And in this particular one, they have 5 phases. Phase 1 is defining what are the requirements. Phase 2 is designing it. 3 is implementation. 4 is kind of checking to make sure it worked and maintaining it. And then 5 is kind of the process improvement verification aspect of it. So real quickly, we're going to walk through these in a little more detail. Next slide. So phase 1 talks about defining competency requirements. And this is where your task analysis comes back into play, right? So even though you're now, you have a focus on roles and jobs, and you're trying to now narrow those down to what is safety critical, at some point, you're going to have to break them down into tasks again, right? Task analysis for almost any type of human factor or human error, all those tools we looked at before, even in the design phase, if you don't understand what the person is doing, you can't really even get started. So it's just a fundamental aspect of human factors and then analyzing human error. So we do the task analysis here, and then you want to try to prioritize that as well. We already talked about that in the SCTA process, but you want to try to understand how difficult these tasks are, what might be the impact if something goes wrong, how often something may happen that or an error may be hit. All of those type of things is what you're doing now to understand from a job perspective who has the highest risk job and what type of tasks are they doing that might lead to a high severity consequence. Okay, next slide. Okay, phase 2 is where you're designing the whole system, right? So this is where you're going to take those jobs that you've now selected, and you're going to break them down into competencies, technical, non-technical. What kind of skills do you need to do this job? Human resources does this on a regular basis if they're in the hiring and recruiting process. Maybe if there's a new position, or maybe it's just as a part of their better understanding performance and what is performance looking at. In order to understand who's performing and who's not, you need to understand, are they meeting expectations? So you have to break a job down into those components. This is really no different than that. So you're breaking it down into competencies. You're now thinking about also how you're going to measure how well they're able to do those skills and competencies. So you're thinking about techniques, tests, interviews, observations, some type of protocol. And we're going to walk through a case study in just a minute to see how this is actually done. But you have to think about, it's not good enough just to say, hey, I think this person needs these skills. If you can't measure to see how well that they're doing them, or can achieve them, or have an aptitude to do them, then it really doesn't do you any benefit to know that, right? So it has to be some type of assessment process in place. And then you want to, what is your motivation? Are you narrowing this down? Are you doing this for a particular reason due to incidents? Are you doing this for everybody, or just a handful of jobs, or whatever it may be? And so then you want to think about other types of exercises or drills or training that might be involved with that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so that took a lot. That phase 2 is the most difficult by far, because you're designing essentially a whole management system, a process around competency. And if you haven't done that already, or you don't have some building blocks, that's going to take some time. Phase 3 is the implementation, right? So now you have a plan, you're going to implement that plan. And this means you're going to actually start taking a look at doing those assessments, possibly, if that's what you decided to do. So it may include scheduling or prioritization, or hierarchy of what comes first versus what comes second, a risk-based approach, because this may be something that takes a long time, depending on how big a system you designed and how big your facility is. If it involves training or doing some coaching, scenario type of drills or exercises, then all of that would be involved, right? And there may be some component linked to your hiring and promotion process as well, but you have to be obviously careful as to how you do that. Okay, next slide. Phase 4 is, kind of looking at what you've done. Now you're assessing the results, if you will. So you've got your results back. Maybe you have some competency gaps in certain areas. You're looking at trends of data, and you're going to analyze that data and then come up with a plan of attack, right? That could be on an individual basis, but obviously you want to look at that on a more global basis as well, right? If you've assessed the job and there's a particular skill that a large section of that group is deficient in, then you need to kind of go back and look at your training, or create maybe new training, or create another way of making sure that they're gaining that skill that they need. Okay, so at this point, you're developing action plans and improving and looking at the results, and then improving all of that. Okay, and then next slide. Really, now you're looking at the overall process, and you're just fine-tuning it. So if this is a new process for you and something completely you've done, it's not going to go perfect the first time. I can assure you. So at this point in time, one of the things that we always do, and when I was when I was a consultant doing this work, we always did a pilot exercise first. So we do one job, one task, whatever it may be, and we would take it through the entire process. And we would take a look at that. And at this point in time in the process is when we would adjust what we were doing. Maybe we need to spend more or less time looking at the job, or more or less time breaking down into subcomponents, or maybe we got the competencies, maybe we're looking at too many, right? And we need to lower the number of competencies down. Whatever it may be, this is the point where you would want to make those improvements to the system and the process. And then as you continue on, it gets better and better. This is your continuous improvement part of the process. Okay. Okay, next, moving on, I think, okay, so here's the case study. And this is the last section of my presentation, is walking through an example. So we've looked at critical task analysis, then we jumped and we've talked about competency challenges, and we've talked about what does a competency management system look like, as well as defining an assessment process. So here's an example where I've gone through this, and I'm going to show you some details of that. So we had a project to do this for the company man, offshore environment, right? And some of the objectives that we had were to conduct safety critical task analysis, to look at key competencies. We already knew the job. So a lot of our work was already done because we'd already narrowed the focus down to, one job, essentially, and all the people that had that particular role in this organization. We wanted to develop fit for purpose assessment protocol. We wanted to administer those assessments to everyone fairly and consistently. We wanted to look at both technical and non-technical competencies. It was to be focused on personal development. So this was not to be used as any type of punitive or performance-based type of review, right? You need to be real careful with that, because if people think you're assessing them and they have their job or their promotion or their raise in salary or compensation, if any of that is in jeopardy, you're not going to get very good results, because they're not going to give you accurate feedback. And this is all based on, what is this person really doing? And if you don't know, then you can't assess it. So you have to be really careful with what you're going to use this information to do. And at the beginning of every one of these processes, it takes quite a bit of effort just to generate rapport and trust to get honest feedback, because without honest feedback, you're starting with misinformation. Okay. Yeah, so we wanted to track and report the trends and to improve system deficiencies, and we wanted to do this as fast as we could and not interrupt the work, as we wanted to be less intrusive as possible, because here we are, this is a critical job. It's in an environment that's not easy to access, and we don't want to spend tons and tons of time, if we can prevent it, being a burden on these individuals, right, or on the corporate system itself. Okay, so these were the objectives that we had. Next slide. The process that we implemented looks very similar to the CMS that we talked about already. We went through, we took a close look at the job itself. We broke it down into tasks. We out of those tasks, we broke it down into competencies and skills that were required. So both technical and non-technical skills. We talked about what kind of tools we wanted to use to assess that. And then what type of methodology that we were going to put in place. And all that's described here in this slide. Okay, so that's what we did on the front end. And then, like I said, we ran a pilot there in step 3. And then step 4 and 5, we broke this down into both an onshore component and an offshore component, which I'll talk a little bit more about. All right, next slide. So if you look at what we did, and the reason we did this was, once again, is to save time and to make the process as efficient as possible. And this is very customized, keep in mind. This was something they wanted to do a deep dive on this particular job. So don't get the impression that, you know, every job has to go this level of detailed analysis, but that was the goal here. Deep dive on this particular job. And it was obviously an offshore environment. So we tried to do as much as we can on all the tests and things that data collection that we were trying to do on the front end onshore. So for example, if you look in the first left-hand box, it says onshore technical assessment. So there was actually a series of questions that were generated. So they could actually go through, I hate to call it a test, but yes, it was a series of question and answers that talked about all different types of their job that were developed by other people that had that job. It was not developed by the human factors side. So all of the technical components are developed. You need a specialist. You need a subject matter expert that can help you develop all that part. The non-technical side is where you traditionally would like to have someone that's got some skills in human factors or understands that, where they can do some of that piece of it, right? So it's a team approach. But that technical assessment we did, like I said, a remote Q&A, so a series of questions that were asked. We did we brought them in physically and had a team-based kind of review and went through like what we call a critical operations exercise. It's basically a tabletop drill where we gave them scenarios and tried to make them as realistic as possible and tried to measure what type of responses they would have from a technical perspective. And then we did some interviews as well, right, individually. Also on the onshore side, so this is before we went offshore, on the non-technical piece, we administered what we call some psychometric tests. So a psychometric test is simply a test that you can go through that measures certain types of skills. You may have taken these for pre-employment. You know, they have some real simple ones that, you know, how fast can you type? They have other ones that are talking about, you know, what is your aptitude for mechanical type of thought processes. So these are all generated by institutes. We don't create them, right? These are all shelf. You can take them off the shelf. There's some on abnormal situations. There's some on decision making. There's some on there's all different types of ones you can pick from. They're fairly quick, and they give you some type of score that will tell you what is their aptitude for different skill sets. That's what they are. We did a behavioral assessment as well. It's called the Hogan. And this basically also, you know, they answer some questions, and some of you have been through these perception or behavioral assessments before. This one focuses on your strengths. And so it will tell you what are you naturally leaning towards? What are your strengths? But the problem is if you lean on those strengths too much, they can have a negative effect. And so there's all different types of tests, but this is the one we chose for this particular job role, okay? And then we also participated, I say we as the human factors specialists, participated in the same interviews and the drills that the technical person was sitting on. So when we were going through these drills, these tabletop exercises, as the person is responding to a technical question, we're also looking at it from a non-technical viewpoint. You know, did they communicate with the right people? Did they make the decision effectively? Did they think about escalation paths? How do they handle teamwork? You know, all these kind of things we're pulling out as much as we can out of these specific exercises. Okay, so we did all that on the onshore side. We collected all those results, And we even had some feedback, some intermediary feedback for these folks where they're not kept in limbo for long periods of time. But then we had an offshore component, and I don't want to spend too much time, but we did a lot of the same things. It's just when you're offshore, you don't have as much time. And so you're focused more on the field observations. You're observing people. What are they doing? You're verifying that the answers that they gave you are accurate and correct. You might have a few follow-up questions, so you might hold another interview or another drill or scenario you might give them that they can actually show you what they would do versus just it being completely theoretical. And then we also did some 360 feedback. Okay. So these are just several of the techniques from many that you could choose from. And these are the ones that we chose for this particular job. All right, next slide. Wrapping up here, these were these little circles here. These were the technical competencies we chose for this job. So you see they're kind of high level. They're very managerial because we're talking about a company man. But say if you were evaluating an electrical technician or a operator or a subsea engineer, you'd have more technical competencies that you'd be focused in on as well. But here you can see there was a kind of a focus on policies, procedures, regulations, best known practices, learning from incidents, the management of change process. You know, all of these were deemed the highest, the most important competencies to measure for this particular job. Okay, next slide. And we already talked about this, but these are the tools we use to assess that. We used some written tests, we did some practical exercises, and we did some interviews to measure the technical skills. Once again, this is led by a technical subject matter expert. Okay, not a human factors expert. Next slide. On the non-technical side, these were the competencies that were chosen. Once again, this is based on looking at the job, looking at the task, going through a task analysis, and extracting out what we feel are the most important non-technical competencies and skills are required for this job. So you can I mean, obviously it's a very senior position, so things like leadership, decision-making, stress tolerance, communication, even delegation. These are very managerial type of skills, right? If you were looking at, once again, a different type of role, you would see less managerial and probably other types of non-technical skills here, okay? But anyway, these are what we decided to look at. And then next slide, which these were the techniques we used, you know. Once again, we did the psychometric tests, things on situational judgment or decision making, leadership. We used some practical exercises and some interviews. And once again, on the exercises and interviews, not probably so much on the interviews, but definitely on the exercises. You can do that as a team. You don't have to do it separately. You can assess technical and non-technical at the same time. Okay, next slide. So what came out of this case study? So it did the results that we got highlighted strengths and weaknesses. So it really did work both on an individual level and a systemic level for the corporation. Some of the things it kind of showed was contractors scored significantly lower than employees. They weren't getting the same training, they didn't have the same experience, and they were definitely some major gaps. Some training areas were found to be deficient. So obviously you have some training in a lot of these skill areas already. So if you find a gap, obviously, you know, the first thing you're going to look at is what training are we giving and why isn't it working? So you can go back and look and say, okay, we have a competency gap, we have a training program, but it's not effective. What can we do to make that training program more effective? Other things like regulatory compliance, company procedures were a couple of big hitters where they needed to spend the most time and effort. So it gave them a focus area. It wasn't that, hey, all 10 technical competencies are a problem. No, we assessed 10 as the most important, but we only found 2 or 3 that maybe need to be addressed. Let's see. Yeah, we didn't have to make a lot of changes after the pilot, but it was very beneficial, as I said before, to go through that pilot and verify that your process is working as you intended to be. Scheduling was a big issue. In this particular case, the onshore-offshore thing worked well. And obviously, nobody wants to go through this exercise. So you have the battle of resistance and having people skeptical. But if you do it correctly and you spend the right time, we've gotten a lot of positive feedback, even on the behavioral analysis. In fact, it's probably the area's highest praise when they understand, hey, I am good at these things, but if I lean on them too much, it can have other repercussions. And that particular tool that we used was a big eye-opener for a lot of people. So these are some of the results that we had on the case study. And then I think the next slide is my last slide. I'll wrap this up. Yeah, so in conclusion, human error is inevitable, but there are a lot of tools and techniques that we have at our disposal. When you can and you're talking about new assets or a new project, start in the design phase. That's really the most effective area to get started on some of this. The critical task analysis, the SCTA, is a great tool. It really helps you break things down into sufficient detail where you can pinpoint and you can get right down to specific human error. One of the things is always when you hear about management systems and you talk about human factors, and it's always this big beast, and what do you do about it? Well, here's a technique that will get you to a specific human error that you can look at and address like any other risk or hazard. Organizational factors like competency are also very important. A well-developed and designed competency management system can give you, as an employer, higher confidence in your personnel and that they're skilled and knowledgeable of all the skills that they need. It can obviously boost performance and efficiency as well, because there's no way to go through these processes without coming up with better ways to do things. So some of the side benefits or procedures might get changed and updated and revised, simplified. Tasks might get adjusted. There should be improvements in day-to-day activities. Reduce risk of human error and process safety events. Hopefully that is a definite. And then just another point under competency is non-technical skills and are just as critical as technical skills. I think if you looked at the examples on a couple of slides back, hopefully everyone would agree that in certain roles, the non-technical skills are actually more important sometimes than technical skills. In a company man job, especially, your ability to handle difficult situations and handle stress and make rational decisions, do so in a timely manner, communicate well. These are some of the most critical skills you can have, and most of them are not technical, right? So once again, just as a reminder, you need to pick the right tool and you need to customize it. We went through some very, very detailed stuff today, and even though I went through it pretty quickly, and you can see how resource intensive it could be, you need to understand that these are just tools and they need to be adjusted to fit your needs. It may be something that you're just looking at one job, or it may be something you're embedded into your design process, or it may be, you've had incidents in a certain area, or maybe you already have safety critical equipment and that's your focus. Just pick apply it in the right way, get the right people to help you as well if you need help, and don't get overwhelmed. Take it one step at a time. Prioritize things based on risk tolerance and risk and tackle it that way. Okay, that is, I think the last slide is just my contact information, or I may have taken it off of your version, but that's it for me. And sorry that I'm probably over on time, but if anybody has any questions or not, I'll turn it back to you where you can monitor and. But thank you. Are you on mute? Because I can't hear you.
Do you want to mention your contact?
Oh, my contact?
Yes, your email.
Yeah, that's fine. If it's I can't share my screen, but it's ergo ERGO TAMU at gmail.com.
Or go
ERGO, sorry. E is an echo, first letter. GO TAMU.
Texas A&M University.
There you go.
At
gmail.com.
So that's it. Okay.
That's it.
Let me stop the recording here.